This happened back in 2004 in northern Wisconsin. I was 16 at the time and out deer hunting with my dad and a friend of his, Frank. I do remember this day like it was yesterday, though. The dialogue isn't word for word, but the idea of it is 100% accurate. As a side note, it was one day after 8 people were shot less than 2 hours away. My dad and I had a few different stands over an area of maybe 3/4 of a square mile. He had been hunting there for at least 10 years, and I had been going with him since I was 5. Up until I was 12, legal age to hunt with a rifle, I had just been tagging along. This particular morning we walked to my stand first. It was about 5 a.m., so still dark outside. I got situated, and my dad and Frank went off to our other 2 stands over a ridge, maybe another 500 to 600 yards off. Sitting there in the dark is always a little eerie. Not long after my dad and Frank left, I see a flashlight from the general direction of where they headed, maybe 200 yards away, roughly moving my direction. I figured they forgot something from the truck or something, so I radioed to see what they were doing. We're sitting in my stand. Frank is about to head to the other one, he says. Obviously, this flashlight is someone else. This isn't super uncommon and isn't really a big deal. Those woods get crowded sometimes and there is a spot to park in that general direction. I turn on my light so the other hunter can see that there is someone there. He stops. I see the light turn and go a different direction. No big deal. I end up dozing off while it's still dark out. When I wake up, the sun is up. It's around 8 a.m. I sit there for a bit, radio my dad to see if he has heard or seen anything moving. Nothing yet. A couple gunshots off in the distance is all. I get up and go for a slow little walk to get my blood moving a bit. Not far, maybe 30 yards out and back, trying not to make a sound. I come back to my stand, sit down and take a real good look around. Nothing really going on. I finally look out to my left where I had seen the flashlight before and see orange. For anyone unfamiliar, hunters have to wear blaze orange during gun season. I radio my dad and Frank to see if either one of them were moving around. Dad says no. I hear nothing from Frank. I grab the binoculars out of my backpack to see if it's Frank. It's definitely not. This guy is looking at me through his scope, rifle aimed directly at me. This is a huge no-no. Massive rule we all learn in hunter's education. Never point your rifle at something you don't intend to shoot. Dumb people still do it though. It's few and far between, but it happens. This is why normal people use binoculars. My first thought was, what a jackass. Thing is, even with me looking at him, he doesn't put his gun down. Now I'm starting to panic, thinking I'm going to be the next hunting murder victim. I slowly grab my rifle and get up, staying behind as many trees as I can, and walk down a little path to the side of my stand. My stand was on this kind of little knoll on the side of a much larger hill. Radio my dad, tell him what's up. He tells me to sit tight and stay out of sight. Obviously, as a 16-year-old, I couldn't do that and had to keep looking. Every time I looked, the guy was still aiming my direction, but was always standing in a different spot. Like I would look, go back to hiding, look again, and he would be 30 yards from where he was the last time. About 10 minutes of this goes by when my dad radios me. "How are you doing, bud?" Looking back, he was very obviously trying to keep me calm. At the time, I thought he just wasn't taking me seriously. He's still there, but he keeps moving. I don't know what his problem is. Dad told me just to keep hidden and he'll figure it out, that he'll be coming up near him in a minute or two. That's when I hear the shot. I lost my mind trying to get a hold of my dad. Did he just get shot? Where the hell is he? Did he have to shoot the guy? What the hell is going on? I sit there for maybe 2 or 3 minutes that felt like hours. All right, come on out and head toward my stand. I peek up over the little knoll I was behind and see my dad waving from along the ridge the random guy had been on. I make the trek on over to him to see what happened. Turns out, Frank was feeling a little restless and took a little stroll and ended up on the other side of that particular ridge the stranger was on, not knowing he was there. He had knocked his radio battery loose while he was getting situated earlier in the morning, and had no idea anything was even going on. The shot I heard was actually Frank shooting a deer. Dad said as soon as Frank shot, the guy walked off away from us toward the logging road. We helped Frank out with his deer and decided to call it an early day. Although I was extremely nervous, the rest of the week went on with no incidents. So, dumbass stranger in the woods with no common sense, let's never meet. To understand my story, you need to know a bit about trespassing laws in our country. Basically, we don't have any, as long as you're respectful and don't damage anything. You can walk over any hills you like and, in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing, so long as you leave the area as you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, which was a bit of a logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. We actually weren't the only ones. There were always yachts bobbing just offshore with people in them and other campers lined up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene, it was very much an informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers nearby, even though this was the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out and got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in the spring of 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in the winter of 2010. After picking her out that November from the shelter as a birthday gift to myself, since I paid her adoption fee. I know most of you love dogs, and she will be very important to the story later on. So let me tell you a little bit about Parmesan. Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dog-fighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a lurcher and staffy mix. She's a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people and most dogs. But you absolutely do not threaten her, she'll have you. So by the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before. But as far as my family is concerned, dogs go on camping trips, so when we all piled into the car, she came too. Unusually though, none of the family friends could make it, so it was only me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. I didn't mind, I wasn't that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog, and I still had my sister. The drive took the better part of 6 hours, and because we'd left a bit later than usual, although I don't remember why, we arrived at sunset. Not a good time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up, with the beach illuminated by campfires. The beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the trunk of the car while they held a flashlight to the sand to see better. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year, and I wanted her to have air. Always gotta look out for my furry little homie. As we're fumbling about in the dark on a beach in the middle of nowhere, it's pretty spooky. The one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big O shape if you felt like it. I wasn't really paying attention to the road. I was complaining that I was tired as kids do, but my mom was. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, my mom asked him if he had seen that car drive around. It's been a few times. My dad kind of shrugged her off. He's like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes, a car pulled up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low except for the flashlights. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point, and I think my mom said it must be security. I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think she meant someone from the Wildlife Trust, as they do occasionally come down to look around. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high because he had that stagger to him. There was no way this guy was sober. Cool, a junkie. Not an unusual find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into the flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches. Although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him. Once he saw this, he got up immediately, holding onto the camping mallet and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we couldn't camp there and that he was just letting us know. My dad tried to stay calm and told him that was fine, we'd leave. But this didn't work. He kept coming closer, so my dad started shouting, and the man kept shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight. And to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. I'm convinced the man would have killed my dad and possibly us as well once he was done. I don't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her, but she's always put Dad and her relationship with him above us. This isn't how it went down, though. Out of nowhere, like a wolf descending on its prey, Parmesan took us all by surprise, most of all the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator large dogs represent in nature. She got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it was in the arm she had grabbed. He kicked her, he punched her, and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan didn't follow him. She stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. As quickly as we could, we gathered our things and got back in the car, all pretty shaken up. I looked Parmy over. She was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I'd left it. We think when the shouting started, she must have put her paws up on the gap I'd left for her. It was an old car with a roll-down window, so we think she managed to hit it with her paws, forcing it down enough to squeeze out. This isn't the end of the story. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided to drive home so we could all feel safe. But first, we had to drive into the nearest town for petrol, as they were running low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a petrol station, but it looked closed. My dad drove up closer to see the sign. My mom asked him what he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. Never. My heart sank. Parked in the corner behind a van so we hadn't seen him at first was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the hood of his car using tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town, but this was remote. The next town was 60 miles away. He didn't have that much petrol, we realized as we started driving. We were going to break down. My dad said it's fine. We had roadside assistance and they'd come tow our vehicle. Better than staying in the last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flashed us from behind. Another car, the same car the man had been driving. It was him following us. He must have realized we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst of my life. I had a complete breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so it wouldn't upset us. But we weren't little kids, we knew how dangerous this was. Dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol, and the man followed us for 55 miles before he finally peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a petrol station and filled up before driving the rest of the way home. My sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it home, just grateful nothing worse had happened. After some sleep, my mom called the non-emergency line for the police to report what happened. They never got back to her, but apparently the woman she spoke to said they might in the future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he actually was that guy or just a random psycho. As I said, they never got back to her. So, what's the takeaway then? Other than crazy man on the beach, let's never meet. For me, it's that I love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grizzled, as one of my mom's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you her thought process. What I do know is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where people abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken to a shelter where her mother and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people treated her when I took her home, she forgave but never forgot. I think the saying goes, I never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person. Dogs have a very good understanding of human body language, and I think she must have understood how much danger we were in. If you're able to, please adopt. You might find yourself in a situation like mine one day. I promise you, if you're willing to save a four-legged friend's life, they'll pay you back tenfold if they're able, without a thought for their own safety. I paid £78 for Parmesan's adoption fee, which is a lot when you're a kid. But it chills me to the bone knowing that if I hadn't insisted on a dog, I might not be here today. Edit. I was not expecting this to get this sort of reaction at all, especially not so quickly. I'm going to answer a few frequently asked questions quickly and then turn notifications off, as I need to get on with my university work. I live in Scotland, and this happened in the Highlands pretty remotely. The drive took so long because we always used this one specific beach, and the car was loaded down with camping supplies, 2 small children, and a dog. The car was heavier than usual, and we took frequent pee breaks. We didn't call the police while we were being followed because we had no signal, or at least that's what my mom said. But I suspect the real reason was that there was weed in the car. My parents used to smoke and deal. I didn't include this in the original story because it didn't affect my experience of it. I was a little kid and I'm telling it from my perspective as I remember it. Thank you all for the awards and for saying so many sweet things about Parmy. At the time I'm writing this, the story that happened to me was 5 days ago. It was on a Saturday. For context, I am a 16-year-old French boy, so sorry in advance if I make any grammar mistakes. I was with my friend this Saturday in my small French hometown, casually hanging out on the edge of town for about an hour. My friend is a 17-year-old girl. We were sitting on big rocks behind the kindergarten of our town, right in front of the beet field. It was around 8 in the evening and the sky was starting to turn dark. Nothing has ever really happened in our town since we've lived there, except recently when a dad stabbed his daughter and wife 40 times. But that has nothing to do with my story. Just note that there aren't many foreigners around since it's a bit of a remote country town, although it's not too far from Paris. So there we were, sitting and eating snacks like we usually do when we hang out, when suddenly I noticed a man with a beanie. His hands were in his sweatshirt pockets and he was walking directly toward us. He was way too close for my friend and me to get up and walk away. He comes right up to us and starts speaking in English. My friend doesn't speak English, so she didn't really know what was happening. The guy comes right in front of me, realizes I can speak English, and tries to shake my hand, which I refused. He didn't look like he was drunk or on drugs, just off in a strange way. The guy started talking to me and pointed to the field behind me, which meant that if I wanted to look, I'd need to turn away from him. Then he says, very insistent, "Is that cabbage?" I responded yes, but he didn't seem satisfied and kept trying to get me to look behind me. I could actually see part of the field out of the corner of my eye off to my left. He tried again and again to get me to look back, which was stressful because he was less than a meter away, close enough to do anything he wanted. Then he started saying some strange things like, "My driver told me there was cabbage," and "I asked people and they didn't understand." Right after he said that, he patted my shoulder, moved behind me, and crouched down by the edge of the field. He kept telling me to come over to check if it was cabbage, even though I had already told him many times that it was cabbage, though really it wasn't, but I was just trying to get rid of him. From where we were sitting, it kind of looked like cabbage though. The moment I realized I was out of his reach, I told my friend to grab her bag and start running. At first she thought I was joking, but when she saw me running, she quickly changed her mind. We were about 20 meters away when he started walking toward us, but then disappeared behind the kindergarten building. We were both really unsettled and decided to head home quickly. We said goodbye and split up, each going in a different direction. To get home, I needed to walk by the elementary school, which was right next to the kindergarten. Suddenly, I saw the guy again. He was coming from the road that ran between the field and the kindergarten, and he was holding his phone, which was lit up in his hand. I quickly turned around and went to my friend's house, waiting there until her father could drive me home. Later that night, my friend and I were talking, and we wondered if it might have been an attempt at kidnapping or something worse, like organ trafficking. It was the first time we'd ever seen a foreigner who didn't speak any French, and it was strange how he left quickly once we started running. It seemed like he was trying to make us lose time with his whole cabbage distraction. That night, I told another friend who lives in our town, and he mentioned seeing the same guy hanging around with the strange behavior earlier that day. We were both really unsettled and scared after what happened, but now we're completely okay. I just wonder if we're overthinking it, even though my intuition told me to get away from him. To the creep who made me feel like I was in a horror movie, let's not meet again. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and plenty of fantastic camping spots. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, many people where I live are struggling financially. I do freelance work as a technical writer, which allows me to work online. If I didn't have that, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that can rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay too long, at least without some other opportunities. Excluding a handful of doctors, lawyers, and Georgia Power employees, the only employment options in the area are at Walmart, fast food restaurants, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest filled with great camping sites and many relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking with my dog, but it can be a bit unnerving sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been numerous vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I assume were car windows. Sometimes there are really suspicious people hanging around these trailheads or just driving on the Forest Service roads. These roads are quite rough, and you'll see beat-up $500 cars barreling along roads meant for four-wheel drives. Some of the people in these cars look like the guy who got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the National Forest, which was probably not legal, I know. We thought we'd turn the paintball trip into a camping adventure so we could play again the next morning. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group had taken up all the spots in the area. This was the only camping spot we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep looking, so we drove for about an hour further into the woods. By this time, it was getting dark, and we were getting a bit worried about finding a place to camp. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that wasn't in great shape. In fact, it looked like the Forest Service rangers had used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay nearby in the woods. That said, it looked like four-wheel drive vehicles had gone over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had high clearance, so we decided to drive over the mound. On the other side was an old gravel road that was mostly clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. However, it was dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running and we set up the tent. As we were setting up, I started to notice a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I saw a green bottle lying on the ground. When I looked at the label, I realized it was a bottle of Home and Garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time and just thought someone had been dumping their garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would dump trash in an area more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 in the evening. As we were eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering through the trees, however the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like the glow you see over a bright city, but we couldn't see the light source itself. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we figured it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend, Isaac, stayed behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. As we started walking toward the light source, the situation became even stranger. All the trees in the area had their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver living in the creek, but it seemed odd that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle. Jacob and I started joking about the ghost beaver, probably talking loudly due to our drunkenness. As we neared the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh my God." A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided maybe we didn't need to see what that light was after all. We walked back in silence, glancing behind us every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to find our way back to the campsite. When we were a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I saw Isaac walking around. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before, and for some reason he was carrying his paintball gun. That seemed a little odd to us. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At that point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From a distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and peering into the tent. As we got closer to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up the road we had come in on. We figured he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to return. Suddenly, he stumbled out of the tent, lurched a few feet, and vomited. After we left, he said he had a few more rum and cokes. We asked him why he kept wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he gave us a strange look. "They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it?" We went to check the truck, entered the door code, and found all our paintball equipment just as we had left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I asked. I was watching a movie on my phone and then I fell asleep, I guess." "You were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets?" Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. We decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We didn't bother to pack up the tent, we just folded it down with the sleeping bags and everything still inside. We jumped in the F-150 and I started to drive out. When we reached the dirt mound, we saw something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier was now back on its stand, right on top of the mound. At this point, we had all sobered up to the situation. No one wanted to get out of the car to try to move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drive forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It fell right off, as it must have just been balanced on top, and we drove over it slowly. We were terrified it would pop one of the truck's tires, but it didn't. As we drove down the road, we noticed a vehicle following us with its lights off. It was probably about 1,000 feet behind us, but we kept catching glimpses of it as the moonlight reflected off it. I started to drive as fast as I could on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle kept pace. It didn't get any closer though, it stayed just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We could only see it when the road straightened out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we made it back to the main paved road, I started to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to go a different way just to be safe. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can also be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again, though. I have had the misfortune of coming across a few scary guys in my life. My friends say I'm a weirdo magnet, so I'm pretty wary and clued up now that I'm a bit older. But when I was a teenager, I suppose you could say I was very naive. Back when I was 20, my family, my mom and little sister, moved from a small rural village in the Shires to a town down south. It was a huge change, and since I had been having a difficult time, I welcomed the change of scenery. It was a beautiful town in an affluent part of the country, but I struggled to find a job and became very frustrated since my mom needed a bit of help with money. Over the course of about 3 months, we became fairly friendly with a middle-aged guy who owned a takeout shop in town. I will call him Phil. Whenever he saw us shopping, he would come over to chat and ask how the family was. He genuinely seemed like a decent, caring guy. So when he mentioned he might have a job for me in his shop, along with a small flat upstairs that I could rent for next to nothing, I thought, okay, great. Maybe things are looking up. Phil got our address and told my mom and me he would pop by early in the evening after he finished work to take me to see the flat. I got myself looking fairly casual but presentable and felt excited and confident, thinking I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone here. I just needed to show him I was sophisticated and would make a great employee. Around 8 p.m., he knocked on the front door, and my mom answered. He told her we would probably only be about half an hour, and that he would have me back safe and sound in no time. I didn't take my phone with me since I had no credit to call out and didn't think I would need it for a quick trip up the road and back. In hindsight, that was a pretty stupid thing to do. Maybe if I had my phone, it would have deterred him from what he was about to do. It was already dark out since it was March. I got into his car and we started driving. He chatted away, asking how I was and telling me what the flat was like. Within a few minutes, I noticed that we were not taking the conventional route into town. At first, I thought he was taking a shortcut around town, but then I realized he was driving in the completely opposite direction. I could tell we were moving away from the populated town and into an area where trees swamped both sides of the road. My brain was working overtime thinking, where the heck is this guy taking me? I managed to keep my composure and asked him outright, "Where are we going? Town's back the other way." He replied, "I just thought I would take you on a little tour. It's beautiful here with many forests and peaceful places. I would love to show you." He said this in his normal cheery tone. I wasn't capable of saying anything at that moment because the logical and reasoning sides of my brain were in a full-blown war. I tried to keep calm, thinking he seemed fairly normal. Why wouldn't he want to show me around? It was a stunning area full of natural beauty, and he was probably proud to show me where he lived. The logical side, however, disagreed. A wave of panic washed over me, and a little voice in my head shouted, "Hell no, are you stupid?" So I just sat there in silence, taking in the scenery, which was becoming more sinister by the second. Every cell in my body screamed at me to find a way out of this situation. I started looking for signposts, houses, any distinctive landmarks, ditches, huge trees, anything that would help me recognize my way back if I had to bolt from his car. Phil must have sensed I was nervous because he kept talking about what the job was like and how his staff were friendly. Before I knew it, he slowed down to a crawl and turned onto a little muddy road with a dense tree line on one side and pitch black open fields on the other. My stomach literally dropped and my body contemplated power vomiting all over his car. The reality of what was about to potentially happen hit me like a freight train. I thought, if I jump out here, I have to run over muddy fields into literally nowhere. My imagination helpfully flashed images of him grabbing me before I could get out the door. So I just sat there, buckled in the passenger seat, not saying a word. I told myself, if he attacks me, don't make a sound. Don't give him the satisfaction of showing him I'm scared. My brain was about as useful as a chocolate teapot, and I was starting to get angry with myself for not doing something, but I was terrified. We emerged at the top of the little dirt road and found a tiny car park surrounded by woodland with one car parked there. It was clear there were people in that car having sex. As he pulled up next to it, I realized he had brought me to a local dogging spot. He turned to me and put his hand on my knee. "We should do what they are doing," he said with a deadly serious expression on his face. I make this bizarre half-nervous laugh, half-garbled, high-pitched whine and try to laugh off this suggestion to show I'm not into it, and I'm super uncomfortable right now. The alarmed expression on his face at my weird gurgled cackle clearly freaked him out, and I mentally congratulated myself for my socially awkward and grossly unsexy reaction. "It will be fun, no one will see us," he persisted. "No, I don't want to, plus I'm kind of seeing someone right now," I lied. But he just sat there smiling at me like a Cheshire cat, as if I would miraculously change my mind at the sight of his weird face. "My mom will be expecting me home now," I told him after an insanely uncomfortable 30 seconds of this, trying my hardest not to make eye contact. "I'm sure she won't mind you being out a bit longer with me. You can trust me, you know." He said this with a straight face as we sat next to the sex wagon parked next to us. I sharply pulled my leg away from his grip and told him again, "Take me home." I looked him straight in the face and he knew I wasn't messing around. "Okay, that's fine, I'll take you back now." Without another word, he drove me out of that creepy, seedy place and back home. I breathed a sigh of relief as I could see my safety literally a few feet away, and before he could stop me, I was out and slammed the door behind me. As I stepped over a tiny rope fence around our garden, he got out of his car and my heart sank. "I think I'll pop in and see your mom quickly," he told me. I swear I could see a smirk on his face, but I knew he was only doing this because he was freaking out, knowing damn well I was going to tell her. He was trying to delay the inevitable or scare me into keeping my mouth shut. Before I could try to talk him out of it, my mom heard us pull up and open the front door. I barged past her, grabbing a small knife out of the kitchen drawer and flying into my little sister's room like a madwoman. "Don't you dare leave this room no matter what you hear," I whispered to her. Seeing the knife stuffed up my sleeve, she just looked at me with panic in her eyes and whispered back, "Okay." I walked back into the living room and the cheeky guy was sprawled out on one sofa, comfortable as if he were at home. I saw red. I swear I felt like the Hulk. I was ready for the bastard. I awkwardly perched myself on the arm of the sofa my mom was sitting on, the absolute furthest away from him I could manage, while he made small talk with my mom about how she was finding the area and if the neighbors were friendly, all the while keeping his beady little weasel eyes on my every move. "Why don't you come and sit over here next to me?" He patted the sofa cushion next to him. "No, I'm all right here, thanks," I told him, fidgeting with my sleeve to keep the knife from falling out in front of him. "Why are you sitting over there? Come on, I won't bite." He laughed and patted the seat next to him again. "No, I'm quite comfortable here, thank you very much." I said this through gritted teeth. My mom, bless her, was looking at each of us during this back and forth like a tennis match. I could see something registering in her eyes. She noticed my behavior was off. I was perched weirdly on the sofa arm, half standing and half sitting, and I was twitchy as hell, staring my mom in the face intensely, mentally trying to speak to her through the power of telepathy alone. I must have looked like a nutter. "It's getting late now, so I think you should go," she finally spoke. My mom started to look anxious as she had finally twigged that something had happened. Phil got up, agreeing and mumbling something about having to check something at his shop. As he walked by me and was nearly out of the room, he paused and turned to me, putting out his hand to shake mine. I thought to myself, what a weird thing to do. I took the opportunity to kindly offer him my hand that had the knife, taking it with a bit more force than is polite. He soon yanked his grubby mitt out of mine when the tip of the blade had jabbed him. He looked down and saw the blade. Then he looked at me. I looked at him with such a disgust. Phil hightailed it out of our home so fast without another word. A prick for a prick. I told my mom everything and she was fuming. We did discuss going to the police, but there wasn't really a crime committed on his part, aside from being a major creep. Sadly, when I mentioned to a couple of girls my age who lived down our street, they clammed up and shot each other a strange look. I guessed he had probably done this type of thing before. We moved away from the area after that, so I'm glad to report I never have to see his smug face ever again. Since my last post sparked quite a discussion, I decided to share another unsettling experience tied to local forests. I grew up in these woods and felt quite comfortable there. However, I stumbled into a few unsettling situations that have stuck in my mind forever. This was one such occasion. I was 18 at the time. One evening, my two friends Mike and Paul and I decided to go camping. Camping might not be the right word since we didn't intend to spend the night. We just wanted to chill and have some fun around a campfire for a while. The plan was simple. Head out, build a campfire, drink a few bottles of wine, eat something, and head back home for a good night's sleep. We met at my house while it was still sunny outside, got ready and headed out. Our destination was an old abandoned quarry in the middle of the woods, about 40 minutes from my house. Even though the quarry had a tragic and, frankly, creepy history, it was a popular spot for such occasions. When we arrived, the sky was already painted red as the sun sank behind the hills. We quickly gathered all the firewood we could find so we wouldn't have to look for it later. As darkness fell, absorbing our surroundings into impenetrable blackness, we managed to get the fire going. We were in a great mood and were getting ready for our first toast when we realized we had made a horrible mistake. We forgot the corkscrew. We tried to open the wine without it, but quickly gave up since the bottles were quite expensive, and we didn't want to damage them. At that point, it was clear that one of us would have to sacrifice himself and jog back to retrieve the corkscrew. After some haggling, I volunteered. However, I had two conditions. First, they would give me a hatchet in case something went wrong along the way. Second, no pranks while I was gone. Mike and Paul agreed without hesitation. They shoved a hatchet into one hand and a flashlight into the other, then sent me on my way. As I jogged through the forest, I heard a noise resembling a wild boar. Suddenly, I remembered a warning I received from an older hunter a few days earlier. He said that this time of year boars were getting dangerous, especially at night. I felt a bit nervous, but luckily I managed to survive without harm. I arrived safely at home, much to the surprise of my mom, who didn't expect me so early. I explained the situation and she just laughed. I grabbed the corkscrew and was on my way again. Not wanting to encounter an unpleasant boar, I chose a slightly longer path this time, cutting through an open field. After a while, I reached our spot. It was a small clearing surrounded on one side by massive rocks, about 70 meters tall, and on the other side by thick forest. Somewhere in the middle of the clearing was our campfire. When I approached, I realized there was no one around, although our backpacks were still on the ground and the fire was burning bright. Great. We specifically agreed that there would be no pranks when I got back. Those dicks think they're funny, I thought to myself. Resigned, I sat down near the fire facing the woods. That's the only place where those two could have hidden, I reasoned. I was really tired and all I could think about was the taste of that exquisite Pinot Noir we brought with us. I really wasn't in the mood for their games and was getting quite mad. That's when I heard the snapping of twigs and rustling leaves from the edge of the forest, about 30 meters from where I was sitting. The sound was rhythmic and unmistakably the sound of someone walking. I aimed my flashlight at the spot where the sounds were coming from. Between the trees, I spotted a tall person wearing a dark hoodie. As I shined my flashlight on him, he stopped walking, turned to me, and just kept staring motionlessly. Even though he was directly facing me, I couldn't really see his face. "Paul, you fat bitch, I know you're trying to scare me. We agreed on this, so stop messing around and come out," I shouted. As I finished, the hooded figure simply turned around and walked deeper into the woods. Just then my phone started ringing. Hastily, I took it out of my pocket. It was Mike. I answered and started barking at him. "Really funny, you assholes. I thought we agreed on this." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you trying to mess with me. I clearly saw you, so you can come out now." Mike seemed to freeze for a moment. For what felt like an eternity, all I could hear was his heavy breathing and Paul mumbling something in the background. When he finally snapped back to reality, he said, "Dude, we're at your house. We heard some footsteps. At first, we thought you were messing with us, but then we got scared and decided to come look for you. I forgot my phone at your house, so we couldn't even call you. Just get the hell out of there and we'll come back for our stuff together." "That's just another one of your pranks and I'm not buying it." "Hold on a second." For a while, all I could hear was some incoherent mumbling. "Hey, what's going on?" asked my mom's voice coming from the phone. My head suddenly spun and my heart skipped a beat as I realized that they weren't kidding. A freezing wave of fear washed over me. However, I managed to convince my mom that everything was just fine and that she didn't need to worry. She handed the phone back to Mike. "Just leave everything and come back. We're heading out now. We'll meet you halfway there." "I'm not going anywhere alone again. You better get your asses here quickly. I'm waiting for you." But I hung up. I didn't want to make any more noise than I already had. I quickly turned off my flashlight and started to back away from the fire's light. I moved all the way to the massive wall of rocks. I figured that if I had my back covered by the rocks, I would eliminate one possible way the unwanted visitor could approach me. I stood there in complete darkness, trying not to make a sound while tightly clutching my hatchet, which would be my best friend for the next half hour. I had to constantly convince myself not to curl into a ball in fear. Even my own body started to betray me as my hearing worsened due to my heart's savage beating. I tried to calm myself, but then again, in the worst-case scenario, every little bit of adrenaline would help. After what seemed like an eternity, I spotted 2 weak beams of light coming from the forest. I heard Paul shout my name. I had never been so relieved. I ran out of my hiding place to greet my 2 friends. For quite some time, we just stood there laughing like maniacs from relief. We even started to get a bit cocky and thought about staying. After all, there was just one supposedly creep lurking among the trees, and there were three of us. Funny how just minutes earlier I had been terrified, and now I was suddenly full of macho bravado, thinking, what could possibly happen? In the end, common sense prevailed, and we decided to leave. We packed our things, put out the fire, and got out of there. We took our bottles of wine to enjoy somewhere else, somewhere that was nice and brightly lit. Hello, I'm French, so I apologize in advance if I make any mistakes. As I just said, I live in France, and this story happened to me this summer, just after the lockdown ended. I was 19 years old at that time. After the lockdown ended, I went to my grandparents' house to spend a few weeks. My grandparents live in a small city in the north of France, and they have a dog who is quite large. When I was really young, I lived with my grandparents for a year, and at that time the dog was only a puppy. Her name is Chippy, which means little devil in English, but in an affectionate way. Since I played with her a lot when I lived there, we are really close, and that will be important later. Two of my hobbies are taking long walks and running. Thus, every evening I would take Chippy for a long walk. There is a path through the forest that leads to a small hill, and at the top there is a large open area with fields. I run there a lot, so I know the place well. The air is fresh and the view is beautiful. I went there with Chippy every day, which also helped my grandparents by giving her plenty of exercise. The first time we went there, nothing special happened. We just enjoyed our walk, which is about 6 to 7 kilometers, so it takes about an hour. The next day when we arrived at the top of the hill in the field, it was probably around 10 p.m., but there was still some light because it was summer. There were 3 other people walking in the fields. They were younger than me, probably about 15 or 16 years old. I also noticed they were smoking, so I guess they came here to avoid being seen by their parents. We passed by them, I greeted them, and they greeted me back. Once again, nothing special happened. For an entire week I took the same walk around the same time, at 10 p.m., and passed by those 3 boys with nothing unusual occurring. I was perfectly fine with that. The second week, as usual, I went for a walk with Chippy and arrived at the fields. This time, only one of those 3 boys was there and he wasn't smoking. When he saw me, I was at the entrance to the field just after climbing the little hill, with the entrance to the forest just behind me. He waved his hand to get my attention and asked if I had a lighter, which I actually had in my pocket. I told him, yeah, sure. So he walked toward me with his hands in the pockets of his hoodie. As he came closer, for some reason, I felt a shiver. It's crazy how sometimes your instinct knows there is a problem, but you don't listen to it because nothing seems off. I handed him the lighter as he passed by, and at that moment my dog was staring at him. Then everything happened very quickly. He made a swift movement with his hand coming from his hoodie, and I only saw something shining. I instinctively threw myself back so hard that I fell down, and I realized that he was holding a knife and had just tried to stab me. What saved me was my dog. When she saw the guy trying to stab me, she jumped on him and he fell down. As I mentioned before, she is a big dog. I immediately got back on my feet and heard something behind me. From the entrance of the forest, I saw 2 guys wearing animal masks running toward me. They were probably the 2 friends. In that moment, your brain takes over. You don't think at all, and in this case, the response I found was simple. The other guy was still on the ground, and I just looked at my dog and told her, "Run." I started running and she followed me, but then I heard the worst possible thing from the guy who had gotten up. "Catch him! Don't let him go!" At that moment, I was completely terrified. I just kept running, hearing them behind me, thinking only, how long will they follow me? Who the hell are they? This was the first time I was truly grateful to be a runner. I was clearly faster than those guys, which saved me because they chased me for what felt like an eternity. Fortunately, at the end of the field, there is another entrance to the forest, and this time it is a downhill path that leads to the road. I heard the footsteps of the 3 guys fading away as I reached the end of the forest. However, I didn't stop running until I got to my grandparents' house and locked myself inside. I took a big breath and gave a huge hug to my dog. I could see in her eyes that she understood what had happened, and I had never been so happy to have her in my life. After that, I told my grandparents everything. We called the police, but they didn't find anyone. I don't know what those guys wanted, but the animal masks made me think of something sinister. I really don't want to know anyway. I still take long walks with Chippy, the hero dog, but I now go earlier in 2 places with more people. I hope you enjoyed my story. I apologize again if I made any mistakes, and to the 3 guys in the forest, let's not ever meet again.